Welcome to the Everything Building Envelope podcast. On this show, we discuss topics relating to the exterior building envelope, such as waterproofing, glazing, cladding, roofing, and more. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes and Stitcher. For previous episodes, show notes, and bonus video content, check out our website, everythingbuildingenvelope.com. Now, here's your host for the Everything Building Envelope podcast.
Welcome, everyone, to our Everything Building Envelope podcast. I am Dan Johnson, the Senior Consultant for GCI Consultants, and I will be your host today. I'm excited to have as a guest Jim Bell, the Director of Operations for the National Storm Shelter Association. Today our topic is what are storm shelters and what are the requirements for a storm shelter. Let's start off by having you tell our audience a little bit about yourself, and then we'll jump into our podcast.
Good morning, Dan, and nice to be here. I started out with wind codes after riding out Hurricane Andrew in South Florida. I was on the fringe of it, the county north of Dade County, and it affected us a lot. And going down and looking at the damage that following weekend, it amazed me, and it lit a fire in me, and I got involved with the codes there, and it kind of expanded and went on to the tornado codes, and I joined the National Storm Shelter Association, which is at the time was out of Texas Tech with Dr. Kiesling, and have since gotten very involved with the national codes and all about shelters.
Okay, Jim, I know you and I go back a ways, back from my storm shelter testing days. And so I know that you've just recently been with the NSSA. So what is the NSSA and what does it serve the industry?
Yes, thanks. The NSSA is an organization started in 2000. It was really started after a series of severe tornadoes in the Lubbock area near Texas Tech. And there was a professor of wind sciences at Texas Tech, Dr. Ernst Kiesling, who started up this organization to talk about how we can prevent loss of life in tornado events. And he is considered the grandfather of the above-ground tornado shelter, and they did a lot of studies. The NSSA was the group that put together the ICC 500, which is the building code in the International Building Code, which covers the United States for shelters, and then partnered with ICC, who then took the code as an ICC standard, and the ICC 500 is NSSA/ICC 500 in the code, which covers how you build a safe room.
I was just going to say, the NSSA is basically like a trade association comprised of many different building officials and also shelter manufacturers, correct?
Correct. We have a membership of industry professionals, architects, engineers. We also have producer members who produce, pre-manufactured shelters for the home, site-built shelters, and then the officials who actually build the community-type large shelters in schools and other types of buildings. We also work with building officials and emergency managers, and then the associations like FEMA and NOAA and NIST are some of the other people that are members of NSSA.
Okay. Yeah, I know that NSSA and ICC and 500, it goes from large structures, down to residences. But for just kind of single-family residents, what type of advice could you give to homeowners about protecting themselves from the severe storms, i.e. hurricanes and tornadoes?
It's a great question. The majority of the calls I get from the general public are just that. How can I protect my family during a severe storm? There's so many different people out selling all kinds of different structures for homeowners. The first thing a homeowner needs to look at is to make sure that the shelter that they're using has been tested. You can ask for a test report. There's a number of test labs. Texas Tech started out doing the testing, but they stopped testing about 5 years ago, and it's basically ITS. There's a new testing lab that's an ICC test lab called NTA, and then there's a UL has done most of the testing, and they're certification agency. So once you test, products get certified that they've met the test, and so the manufacturer who did the testing will use that documentation and continually building their shelters to meet the code. So you have to look for a label from one of those certification agencies on it first started out for the doors, because the doors are the most severely affected by tornado shelters. They have to open and close like regular doors, but they have to act like the wall during a storm. So the doors are the most vulnerable, and they should definitely per code have a label on them, but now they're asking for labels for the entire shelter. And a homeowner should ask for that material, or at least ask for a test report that their shelter has been tested to go forward. It's an ongoing process. Some manufacturers are in the process, some manufacturers, but they can at least give you a test report showing that they did test.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned testing and labeling and that type of thing. I believe ICC 500, the 2020 version, is kind of the test standard that's required. What are some of the requirements of the ICC 500, and then also kind of branching off a little bit to the FEMA 320 and FEMA P361 guidelines? That, if you can get a few of the highlights of those documents.
Yeah. First off, and that's a good point, Dan, that ICC 500 is the code. It's the code of the land. FEMA 320 and 361 were the first that came out there. They're excellent documents of, especially FEMA 320 for residential shelters, but they still have to meet the ICC 500. FEMA 320 and 361 calls themselves near absolute protection. They talk a lot about operations and siting, and a little bit more severe. Just for a quick clarification, FEMA calls their shelters safe rooms, and ICC 500 calls them tornado shelters or shelters. Kind of the testing standards that we look at, they're tested for structural load. Well, they go into a wind wall that they're put up against, and they're tested for pressure to meet a 250 mile an hour wind. And that will vary from the size of the structure that you're doing, but it should show that you were tested for a static load of 250 miles an hour. Then the doors separately are tested for in-swing and out-swing. And a door, we talk about door, but it's the assembly. And that's for windows, doors, overhead doors are tested as an assembly, not components. So when you use a door, a window, it's got to be used as it was tested, or it's not the same thing. And then you do an impact test, and the impact test is for a 250 mile an hour area, which is the most severe tornado area, which encompasses about 15 states in the middle of the country. And they test to a 15-pound 2x4 at 100 miles per hour. And then they test to make sure there's no perforation of the wall or the door that you're using. And then they also, for deflection, because if that impact hits and deflects more than 3 inches, that they'll fail a test. Then there need to be engineered drawings of how the materials that they use to build the shelter is put together. They also do calculations for anchors of how it anchors into the ground. Specific anchors are usually required. So a homeowner needs to make sure that they're using the appropriate anchor. The slab that it goes into, it needs to be on a slab. It can't be, installed in your house. If your house is not sitting on a slab, it has to sit, it has to be mounted to the slab. So it makes for different areas that you have to check, and you have to make sure the slab is thick enough in order to hold that, to keep that shelter from being hit or being toppled over by the wind, being picked up with the house when the house is destroyed. So anchoring is a very important aspect of, and those anchors are calculated for shear and uplift. And Dan, did I miss anything about testing a residential. There's a bunch more that goes into a community shelter as far as engineering is concerned. I'm just trying to cover the residential shelter right now.
Yeah, no, you hit the residential shelter on very well. Like you had mentioned, there's a criteria, and basically that's just to make sure, like as you said, if you're inside the shelter, if a piece of debris is thrown by the tornado that hits the shelter, it can deflect, but you want to make sure that the people inside of the shelter don't get injured. I think that's the amazing deflection. One thing that that I always thought was kind of bizarre was, after the testing was done, the shelter was just looked in this horrible shape, which makes sense. And there is no way that the door can open up in order for to get out again until some fire department or somebody comes in and opens up the door for them. But they're safe, which is exactly what the shelter meant to satisfy.
Two of my most important aspects is that, number one, when you're inside of a shelter, don't lean against the wall, because you've seen the Newton's cradle where the energy transfers through the balls. You lift up one ball on one end and you let it go, and it transfers to the other end. It's a transfer of energy through solid objects, and that'll happen in a tornado shelter. So I'm glad you brought that up. It's very important. And then the other thing is the fact that we do a certificate for a homeowner that will include the GPS address of your home, and then we ask those homeowners to get with their first responders to give them that GPS address so they can come and find you, just in case you do get locked into the shelter after the storm, that they'll be there first to make sure that they will be able to help you out. You should have some tools inside the shelter that kind of would help that, but yeah, definitely. And those are two important aspects.
Yeah, and like you said, the main thing for a storm shelter is to keep the inhabitants inside of it safe during the storm. Getting out again, that's all secondary, but everybody will be safe. I agree.
Absolutely.
Just kind of a general. If a family is looking for a shelter, what things should they look for to see what's right for them?
You need at least, I think, 3 square feet per person inside your shelter. So you should know how many people are going to be using your shelter so you can get the right square footage of a shelter. If you're going to allow a couple of neighbors to come in with you, I think it's a great idea for several neighbors to get together and build a shelter, but or family members or whatever. But the first thing is the square footage, of making sure that you just don't buy a shelter and then you find out that you can't fit everyone in there. The second thing that I've mentioned before is that it's been tested properly, that it's properly certified. You'll have certifications that are listed with whoever tested. If you've gone UL, ITS, NTA, they will have records online, and you can go see what they tested with and the components within that shelter that they tested with. So it's always a good reference to pick up. The shelter manufacturer should be able to give that to you, though, if you ask for it, of their testing requirements. The one question is above ground, below ground. If done properly and tested properly, they're both safe. Both have their pluses and minuses. That you might want to make that determination of where you want to have the shelter. I know below ground shelters have an issue with water and ventilation, but the ones that are done right, you shouldn't have that problem with. Also, that they're installed properly, because if the water table comes up, during the storm, we've seen below ground shelters pop up out of the ground because the water pressure pushes them up. They can be handled with installation. We'll put anchors or webs in them so they won't do that, but something that you can ask. And of course, and this is a general statement, but usually the cheapest product's probably not your best well-tested product. You can make these things cheap with using inexpensive doors on them or inexpensive materials, but when you're in a shelter, sitting in there with your family and a tornado's coming, you got that loud noise, you don't want to be worried about whether or not that shelter is going to be there. You want to be at least have that feeling that you did the right thing and your family's safe.
Yeah, for that reassurance, you had mentioned, the SCC 500 code, kind of has a requirement for, I believe it was like for certification and listing of the product. And basically, there isn't any substitutions allowed from the tested product versus what's installed. Is that correct?
None. One of the issues we have when our shelters get older, hinges may sag or the latches may break. You have to replace. It's very important to replace exactly what it was tested with. And generally, especially community shelters, the hardware on there is just not your regular hardware that you buy. And even on your storm shelter, residential storm shelter could have steel bars and deadbolts and things. But still, you have to use the same ones that were tested because it's important that everything interacts properly, that it's aligned, that the bolt on the shelter that keeps the doors closed have enough engagement into the strikes or the frame that holds it to the shelter itself is the same. There's a lot of testing, and Dan will attest that there's a lot of failures with tests as you're testing products to come up with the right combinations that work with different materials. If you've got a very stiff shelter wall, your poured solid concrete, the anchors that you may use to hold the shelter in or the hardware that holds the shelter door closed have to engage differently. If the door is very flexible and it bows during the storm, you got to have longer engagements. So the testing process tests all that out to make sure that you get the right combination that will hold. And like I said, these tests aren't inexpensive, so engine companies go in thinking they're going to pass, and when they don't, it's a big deal because they got to go test again, but they got to find the right products that will meet the code. That's why it's the shelter, the doors, the windows, everything that's in a shelter has to be tested and has to be used as tested because, if you make a deviation, you change the type of anchors, it can make a severe effect on whether or not that shelter will hold up. One of the observations that I made going down to South Florida after Hurricane Andrew was I'm walking through neighborhoods where none of the windows were in, most of the building in South Florida was CBS block, and that's what they used to build just a regular home to meet the hurricanes down there. And that you'd walk through and you'd see a concrete opening, and where a window used to be, it's just concrete because the window was just either toe-nailed in or just using concrete nails or whatever to hold it in, and it just pulled it right out. That was the pressure. And we found the window where the glass wasn't even broken. The window was sitting inside the house, laying on a bed or something that it just popped out of the opening. So the anchoring, is very critical, and the correct anchoring that was supposed to go with the product is very important. And hurricane safe rooms and tornado safe rooms.
Yeah, that's very true. Like you had mentioned, depending on the substrate that you're attaching, your door or window into, it makes a huge difference. You can have wood substrates, but they definitely need to be reinforced.
Right. And that's the key, that even a building inspector can inspect that to make sure it's correct, because a lot of times they won't see the anchors. So it's important. And commercial buildings, they do an anchor inspection before they can cover it up, and so they can actually see the anchors used. So it's very important that when a homeowner is working with their shelter manufacturer, and you'll end up having a good relationship with him, he'll tell you what anchors he used, he'll show them to you. I've had a few calls in my tenure at NSSA where they had a failure and they found out that they didn't use the correct anchors. And the failure wasn't even during a tornado, it was just regular operations. And so the one, they had to come back and replace the shelter because it wasn't put in correctly. So It's important to have confidence with your supplier of the shelter.
Yeah, exactly. And in order to gain that confidence is to have, like you had mentioned, the written documentation that the shelters have been tested and certified and listed by a reputable company. Yeah, that is very true.
Yes.
You had initially kind of talked about a couple different naming structures types of things. So what's kind of the difference between a properly constructed tornado shelter? a safe room or a best available refuge area?
It's very important. A tornado shelter has to meet the ICC 500, and basically in Section 423 of the building code, if you're going to put a shelter in, it has to meet the ICC 500. It's like I said, it's Section 423 that tells you that shelters have to meet the ICC 500. For years, being in the door industry is where I come from, that I'll hear architects come in and say, well, we want to put in a shelter that will meet an EF2 tornado, but I don't need one to meet an EF5 tornado. Well, there is nothing that's tested in between. You either test the worst case for the area that you're building the shelter. Now, you could have a shelter, let's say in Florida, that has a wind load of, in Florida, I think it is 100-mile-an-hour missile speed, but they only have to test with a 9-pound 2x4 instead of a 15-pound 2x4 for essential facilities. In the regular building code, the impact test for just a regular object to be put in a home in Florida that's not a shelter, they use a 9-pound 2x4 at 34 miles an hour, which hits with 350 foot-pounds of force. Then you get into a tornado impact of a 15-pound 2x4 at 100 miles an hour and at 5,000 foot-pounds of force. So there's completely different hurricane and tornado, even though they're tested pretty much the same way. The pressures and the impacts are completely different. So you never use a hurricane-tested device in a tornado. I think you would probably be safe if you use a tornado device and a hurricane device. But then we get into the best available refuge area, which is what happened in Illinois this past December when that Amazon building was torn apart and they had 9 deaths in there. Well, they had best available refuge areas, which did meet the code. That Amazon did nothing wrong with providing these best available refuge areas, but that's just a regular building that they go in, and that's the safest place they can be in the building without having a tornado shelter. So they pick areas without windows, but they won't withstand impacts and they won't withstand falling debris. And that's what happened there, was the fact that they had best available refuge areas. The code requires certain types of buildings to have shelters and safe rooms, which are basically right now requirements in the 250-mile-an-hour wind zone require schools, emergency operations centers, police stations, fire stations, 911 call centers. They're protecting the first responders and the most vulnerable, the children in schools, but it's not required for any other type of building. And there are communities across the country right now are looking into, especially after the Amazon building, of maybe requiring it for occupied warehouse spaces where they'd have to have a tornado shelter in it. But a best available refuge area is, and architects can go in and do a survey and find out which area would be the least hazardous to be, but it's not saying you won't get injured or you won't be killed in that area. It's just saying that's the best place to be until you put in a tornado shelter. Be careful. I see all the time, I go into buildings and look at a bathroom door with a push-pull, and it's a hollow core wood door, and they have tornado shelter sticker on the door. That's not a tornado shelter. At best, it would be a best available refuge area. So all over the country, they mislabel openings. And either one of my biggest is that, there's a lot of home builders who will say they have a shelter in a new home that they put in. They separated a space. It may be they put, block walls in. They don't usually put in a tornado door in it. And sometimes if it's on a house that's built up on, there's a crawl space underneath the house, whatever tornado shelter you put in it, it's going to go when the house goes because it's not anchored to a concrete slab. So a lot of people misuse the term tornado shelter when they're just putting in the best available refuge area. If I get one thing through in my tenure here is the fact that if it is a tornado shelter, market a tornado shelter. If it's not, market a best available refuge area. You're telling people they'll be safe in this room when they won't be. So that's my message for the day.
That is some very good food for thought, because even, myself, when you're in larger buildings, you see the signs all the time, tornado shelter, storm shelter, or whatever. And in your mind, you think, well, of course, that's where you need to go if a storm happens. But in your mind, you should think, well, then I should be safe in there. But like you said, you're safe from a storm, but not a spiritual. Basically what you're saying.
Yes, very much so. And I'll say one thing here. I have much respect for building officials. I've trained many, many, many building officials, and they have 10, 20 homes to inspect. They're inspecting roofing and plumbing, electrical, and everything else. They don't really have time to inspect your tornado shelter. We're making it easier to inspect with the labels. If all they got to do is go in there and look for the label saying what it was tested for. I see people test for a hurricane wind pressure and then stick it on a tornado shelter, and it's tested to 200 miles an hour instead of 250 miles an hour. It makes a difference, and the building official can catch that very quickly by just looking at the label and making sure they'll know what territory that they're in. Just doing a quick review of the tornado shelter for the benefit of the homeowner, but very little of that gets done. And I think as many codes as we have, and we've got very intelligent, very dedicated people serving on the ICC 500 committees and the FEMA 361 and 320 committees, but none of that is any good unless it's policed. And the only people that can make sure that those are correct are building officials and emergency managers' offices. And I just implore them to maybe hire some extra staff to take a look at these, because there's a lot of shelters going in. I get a lot of calls from people that after they hear of a severe tornado outbreak, a lot of people are looking to invest in putting a shelter in their home. I just would like to make sure that we're looking at and make sure that they're safe.
Yeah, I agree. That's kind of one of the areas that I believe you and I talked on in the past, that kind of needs probably the most improvement, just kind of increasing, the staff size, to make sure that structures are being built for that geographical area, to sustain to the codes. Are there any other areas that you see, in your opinion, that should be improved on for the general public, to just keep them safe?
Well, one of the things we're struggling with right now is keeping up. A shelter manufacturer, usually they're smaller family-owned companies that have done a good job over the years of trying to keep up. The latest codes, we ran into an issue where the state of Georgia had a rebate program that came out that said that the shelters that are put in to get rebate money have to meet the 2020 code, which requires the labeling, the listings of the products that are in a shelter, and also it has to have a follow-up where every year they get reviewed by their certifier that they're still making them the same way that they tested them. And doing a survey, really nobody met the 2020 code. They didn't have a lot of them that had labels. Now, there are several that are in the process. It's not an easy process to go through, and they're doing it, but a lot of people don't meet the 2020 code because, their shelters aren't labeled and their doors aren't labeled. That's taking time. Now, I know FEMA got involved and a couple other organizations, and they gave them a 2-year open window to get that done so that they can still produce tornado shelters for people who need them, but they may not have the labels yet. Well, that happened almost a year ago, so we're coming up on another year to make sure and that gives not only the homeowner a way to make sure he's getting the proper shelter, but also the building official to make sure that the proper shelter is being used if they've got the proper labels and the testing requirements. And so when that happens, when everyone gets up to the latest code, I think that's probably the most important thing that gets done. A lot of community shelters are being put in schools, and they have proper inspections. They have proper, the architect's got to have their drawings. All the trades have to meet the tornado and hurricane code. I think that's going pretty well right now. I tell people that when they're looking for a tornado shelter to go to, when there's a storm imminent, there's not a lot of community type shelters that everyone can go to. Most of the shelters are protecting the first responders. School shelters are protecting the school children, but not all of them are opening to the general public. I know Alabama did a great job in the Birmingham area putting up large domed public shelters and that serves certain communities after the tornadoes they went through in 2011 and after they've had a lot of severe tornadoes. So they put up big community shelters that'll hold 1,000 people. But the best way to protect yourself from a tornado is have a tornado shelter in your home. That way you're assured you're not in your home 24 hours a day. So I would say I'd make sure that there is somewhere that I can go if I'm not at my home, but at least make sure that your family can be protected in your home by having a residential shelter.
Yep, that sounds like a great theme to kind of recap our talk today. Be safe. That's the biggest thing. And Jim, it's been great talking today, and I appreciate you coming on with me. So listeners who want to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to contact you?
You can go to nssa.cc, and the telephone number is there. You can reach me. I'll give you my home numbers. It's 954-253-0883. And I'd be glad to talk to you. I'm always happy to talk to homeowners who are looking to put in. I may not have, the right answers. Like I said, that a lot of companies right now are working towards getting their products. They tested in Texas Tech back in 2010, 2009, and there have been some changes in the codes. They didn't have labels at the time. They had some different requirements, so that to get something that's up to date, I tell people just make sure they have something that has been tested and is proven that it has been tested. Even if it was an old test, you're better than having no test at all. So, but please, call me. That's what I do. All
right. Well, thank you, Jim, for coming on. And I'd also like to thank everyone for listening to our podcast today. If you'd like more information about our company, GCI Consultants, you can find it on our website at www.gciconsultants.com, or you can give us a call at 877-740-9990. Thank you once again, and I look forward to talking with everyone next time on Everything Building Envelope Podcast. This is Dan Johnson saying so long.
Thanks for joining us today. Please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. For more information on the Everything Building Envelope, previous episodes, show notes, bonus video content, and much more, check out our website, everythingbuildingenvelope.com.